So the assessment was a real learning experience, both in terms of content and process. And it was an eye-opener, I have to say, for me as the head of the organization. There were some things that I imagined and expected, and there were some things that really surprised me. I think among the things that we learned was that there was a high level of commitment at almost a gut level on the part of our staff to the importance of this work and the importance of focusing on this work. And when people were asked about the specifics of how equity and racial equity was manifesting or not manifesting in the organizations, there were a lot of really varied perspectives. There were a lot of different understandings of what seemed on the surface to be the same thing, depending on who the person was and what their own experience was. And we learned that we had a lot of work to do. We learned that that there was a great gut commitment, but there was a relatively low level of understanding of what racial equity actually means, and the specifics of it, and that there were a whole variety of ways in which we as an organization were not yet stepping up to the plate. The assessment was really good at identifying very specific places in the organization where we were unconsciously replicating the lack of racial equity in our society and needed to address those. We also learned how fundamentally important it was to start having this conversation, to start naming these issues, to start talking about them in the organization. We learned about the importance of budget and thinking differently about our budget. And we learned about the importance of information sharing and how narratives get created when there is a vacuum of information. I could go on and on and on. This was a very lengthy audit that was done. And then we also had to struggle once the audit was done with what do we do with the audit? Who sees who sees the audit? I mean, in what form and how do we both have authenticity and transparency on the one hand, while on the other hand, protecting our ability to move forward by not having the whole thing, frankly, blow up, right, and demoralizing people. And so that was all of those things. It was a huge, huge undertaking, the work around that audit. A great example that came out in the audit of how we were replicating inequity in the organization was around a program that we launched a number of years ago in Harlem. It was called Sage Harlem. And this is also a great example of how people with different lenses and experiences can bring different perspectives. So that program was a relatively small program in terms of the space that it had to work in, the resources for it. As the head of the organization, I felt a pride in the fact that the program existed and we had been able to somewhat increase the resources. But what came back really powerfully in the response of a number of our staff in the organization was they saw the program as a concrete illustration of inequity at Sage, because what they saw is that the program was not resourced anywhere near as well as some other programs, including in a very visible way, which was the program space that was located in. And so, I could think of it from where I sat as this is progress, it's better than it was. But the reality is it was a manifestation of inequity and inequitable allocation of resources in the organization. And while we could we could have all kinds of explanations for that in terms of funding streams and this and that, the bottom line was that it was what it was. It was an inequitable allocation of resources that, in all honesty, I didn't see it and understand it that way until that audit. So that's one very specific example.